Hey, wrestling fans, how you guys doing today? So I just want to do a short video and talking about what the territories could have done in terms of stopping Vince McMahon. What could they have done? Okay, so we know that Vince McMahon bought the WWF in 1982 from his father, Vince Sr., and Vince Jr. had a plan to take over the wrestling world. Now, at this time in 1982, wrestling was broken up into several different regional territories. And most modern wrestling fans, they've heard of this concept, but they don't know how it was in terms of if you lived in one part of the country at that time, you only could watch the pro wrestling that was in your territory. So, for example, if you lived in Florida, you only had Florida Championship Wrestling available because in 1982, cable TV was barely making a dent. And even on cable in 1982, you only had Georgia Championship Wrestling. So Georgia Championship Wrestling was really the only promotion that people could watch that lived outside, from another territory. So at this time in pro wrestling, you had several territories that were part of what we call the National Wrestling Alliance. And you had Mid-Atlantic, Georgia, Florida, World Class, which is your Dallas territory. You had Houston, St. Louis. You had Continental, which was Southeastern. Like I said, Georgia Championship Wrestling, Mid-Atlantic. Those are just a few. Not Detroit. They were out of business by then. And then you had the AWA, which was another big promotion like the WWF, but it was based in the Midwest, based out of Minneapolis, Minnesota. Then you had Vince and the WWF. They're now called WWE. At one time, they were only in the Northeast. Okay, so that's how it was in pro wrestling in 1982. Every territory how they ran their wrestling promotion is they did a circuit around the territory into the towns that they were broadcasting syndicated television shows. And those syndicated TV shows, one second, I'm turning the TV down. All right, that was a little loud. So those syndicated TV shows pretty much would be like a 1 hour, almost like an infomercial, right? And basically what they would have squash matches. And squash matches were matches where they would pit a name wrestler against a jobber. A jobber was a guy who would commonly lose matches on TV, but his whole job was to enhance the name wrestler and his reputation. And so the reason why they did that is because they didn't want to give the good matches for free on TV so that you can go to the arena to buy your tickets. And that's how it was. So say a given wrestling territory, say the AWA, they'd buy syndicated TV shows in their territory, which is Minnesota, Chicago, Winnipeg, Canada, Denver, Colorado, Salt Lake City, Utah, Omaha, Nebraska, Green Bay, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, etc. And they do their syndicated TV show they do from the studios in their home base, which is Minneapolis. They'd bicycle out that show to all the towns. And not only would they have the squash matches, but they would have interviews hyping up the arena shows. The arena shows back then is what made pro wrestling money. It wasn't TV. TV was used as an infomercial to get people to the arenas, which is where you made your money. And pro wrestling back then, they ran every night of the week. 365 days you wrestled pretty much for the most part. And so you had the NWA, which was at this time mostly Southern. Okay, like I said, Georgia, Mid-Atlantic, Florida, Continental, which was this like Alabama area. You had World Class, which is in Texas, Dallas specifically. You had other territories. Then you had, and they had St. Louis and Houston. And then you had your independent, which is like Mid-South, Louisiana, Arkansas, part of Texas, Oklahoma. I said Mississippi, right? Then you had Mid-Southern, which was part of the AWA there, Memphis, Tennessee, and parts of Missouri. And then you have AWA in the Upper Midwest, WWF Northeast, and then you had Portland, Pacific Northwest, and Portland, Washington State. Then you had Canada had their territory, Stampede, Western Canada. You had Montreal. You had the Toronto Maple Leaf Wrestling, which is part of the NWA. So Vince then decided in 1982, when he bought the promotion, he was going to take his promotion nationwide. Because at this time, there was a gentleman's agreement among the promoters that they would not step over each other's territory. Okay, so if you lived, for example, in New York, you could only watch WWF wrestling. Because remember, cable is in its infancy and only Georgia Championship Wrestling was available. So you can only watch WWF. So you didn't know what was going on in the other territories. And that was actually beneficial to the business because once a wrestler in one territory stayed too long and his drawing power started going down, he can go to another territory and those fans would have never seen him and they would have been none the wiser, and he's going as fresh talent. So he can regain his drawing power that he was starting to lose by staying too long in another territory. So they would rotate the wrestlers around all the territories and it kept them fresh, which meant they could keep their box office appeal. So that's how it was in wrestling. If you lived in San Francisco, you can only see the San Francisco promotion. If you lived in LA, you can only see Olympic Auditorium Wrestling. If you lived in Dallas, you could only see World Class. You didn't see other promotions. The only way you knew about the other promotions was through the magazines like Pro Wrestling Illustrated, Inside Wrestling, The Wrestler, and all those magazines. So Vince in 1982 decided to take pro wrestling nationwide, but he didn't start it right away, okay? Because again, you got to remember the culture of pro wrestling at that time was very territorial and regional. So he had to lay out a plan because it would have been a yeoman's task to take a wrestling company, a promotion, and take it nationwide. Want to know why? Because cable was still in its infancy. And again, back then, wrestling didn't make its money on TV. They made their money with the house shows, which was the arena shows. And so Vince buys the WWF in 1982. Bob Backlund is his champion. And Bob Backlund, as we know, was a great champion, but he wouldn't embody what Vince eventually wanted in a champion. You know, Vince wanted a guy that could lead the WWF to be marketable to the whole nation. Okay, a guy that could sell T-shirts, lunchboxes, a superhero type of wrestler. And Bob Backlund, as great as he was, my favorite WWF champion, was not in that mold. So first, Vince had to scout for the guy that he was going to need to take the WWF nationwide, to go to war against the other territories, and to eventually run them out of business, and then eventually have a monopoly on pro wrestling. So that is what the plan was for Vince. If you were a wrestling at this fan at this time, you didn't know that this is the goal, because at that time, pro wrestling was a very secretive business. And this is why the name of the channel, Kayfabe All Day, it's called like that because kayfabe is a term in pro wrestling where you keep the secrets of pro wrestling exactly secret. So you kayfabe people, you do a work on them. And so pro wrestling at that time, the wrestlers, when they went out in public, they had to act like everything was like real, authentic, legit in terms of their enemies. So, for example, two guys who were enemies in the ring and on TV could have been real good friends in real life because they're working together. You have the baby face, which is the good guy, and the heel, which is the bad guy. But because even if they were good friends, because of kayfabe, they couldn't go out in public together because it would expose the business. Part of the appeal of the business, especially at that time, was that these two guys really don't like each other, and that's what would sell the tickets. So Vince had to get his guy, and he had to lay out a plan. How was he going to do this? Because again, cable's in its infancy, and it would take a long time anyways for cable to be this like really all-encompassing thing that it now is, right? Or that it would become in the 90s. Although even by the mid-80s, cable became very powerful. So he was going to have to do it through syndication. Syndication, basically, you have to go to local TV stations. And at that time, pro wrestling territories the TV stations love pro wrestling content because it got high ratings. So they would pay the promoters to put their show on the air. And the thing that they would get out of it was they would get the revenue from the ads. And so Vince had a plan in how he was going to go into the other wrestling territories and go to the TV stations in those markets and get TV time. Okay, so he had a very risky but brilliant plan to do that, because why would these TV stations put Vince on the air when they already had someone else on the air? Because those TV stations were loyal to the local promotions. Because at that time in pro wrestling, a local territory, say Mid-Atlantic, and their promoter Jim Crockett, he had excellent relationships with the arenas, the promoters, the athletic commission, the TV station, even local newspapers, because they would do the pro wrestling territories. They would do like charitable events for the community. So it was really a local thing. And Vince was planning to go nationwide to take his company, WWF, out of the Northeast all across the nation. And obviously he succeeded, because today everybody thinks of, when they think of pro wrestling, they think of WWE, okay? And they don't know the roots. They don't know that at one time WWE was WWF, and it was only in the Northeast. And if you lived outside the Northeast, you had never even heard of the WWF unless you bought the wrestling magazines. So what was special about this time period, because of that, there was a mystique about pro wrestling. It was exciting to get your magazine at the local grocery store or liquor store and see what was going on in the whole wrestling world outside of your territory. So that was a very exciting time. So that was Vince's plan. Now, in 1982, Vince obviously is probably just planning this. Nothing happened. Wrestling was still as it always was, regional, territorial. So in 1983, we start to see a few signs of what Vince is going to do. Although at the time, nobody's none the wiser, because again, pro wrestling stays regional. And Vince, in 1983, he made a little bit of noise among the wrestling community, because he would send Bob Backlund, his champion, because it was very common for there were 3 world champions at this time. And I'm just going to mention who they were, then I'm going to end the video because I got to drive out to LA and I'll continue the series. There was Bob Backlund of the WWF, which was Northeast, NWA, which was multi-promotional. So it wasn't just one territory. They had a bunch of territories under their umbrella. And they had a world champion, which was the most respected world championship because it was the oldest, and they would travel the world. And that was the Ric Flair at this time. Then you had the AWA, which was the upper Midwest, part of the West Coast, San Francisco, and their champion was Nick Bockwinkel. Those were the 3 sanctioned world champions. And oftentimes the world champions would be sent to other territories to defend their title against those territories' top baby faces and heels. But anyways, I'm going to end the stream because I'm going to drive out to LA to celebrate Thanksgiving. God bless you guys, and hope you enjoy more stories about kayfabe pro wrestling.